So I think we are officially live for our second ever episode. I guess I'm Kyle Cordes at Oasis Digital. Introduce.
I'm Lance Finney, also with Oasis Digital.
I'm Chris Harden, also with Oasis Digital.
So I don't know if we'll have any viewers, but if anyone does, we welcome. It looks like I'm monitoring kind of the other end of this. It looks like we are successfully actually on YouTube. So I have no idea if anyone is watching or if anyone will. Although at one point it said 4 people were waiting. So maybe once we start, they'll just bail out.
Well, I have 4 tabs open right now on the screen, so that's all it is.
Very nice. So I guess our a light topic I wanted to talk about a little bit is that I believe Chris has one of those amazing new super fast no fan Macs.
Yes.
And like I have so far resisted buying one, but I would love to hear how the experience is going, and feel free to tell me it's bad to save me a couple $1,000s.
I absolutely love it. So my previous Mac was a 2012 MacBook Pro that I was holding on to forever. And then I finally ordered this one 45 minutes after the Apple event. And again, the 45 minutes was just because it took me that long to figure out which new Mac to buy. But so I went with the MacBook Air because I don't care about the touch bar, and they seemed otherwise the same. So the only argument I've seen for getting a Pro instead of the Air is that the idea that having a fan might increase performance by, preventing it from throttling when it gets hot. But I've never seen my MacBook Air get hot, so it's never been an issue. I've never taxed it out. I run JetBrains products, which are notoriously memory intensive for development, and I can have like 5 WebStorm windows and a couple IntelliJ projects open at the same time, a bunch of other crap, and it never gets swarmed, it's totally fine. The only thing that ever made it even approach like 80% of the CPU was rendering a video, which I did once, but actual like software development is like no big deal. So
do you know if behind the scenes, like the Java runtime or Node or whatever, are those natively using the new chip? Are those emulated? Let me bring it up real quick. So I'm just bringing it up from my own here. So an activity monitor on the new Macs, it actually when you go to see like performance and CPU, it actually has a column now that says architecture. So now you can just look and see if it's like old or new.
Right. You can totally just sort by either says Intel or Apple. Oh wow. I have like 5 billion Google backup and sync processes running, so that seems odd.
Yeah, but they haven't slowed down your computer at all. That's impressive.
No, right? Literally, I just opened this and I'm like, what's Intel? And there's like I can count maybe like 30 that say backup and sync from Google, like just sitting there like what the. But yeah, it's not really stressing it out, so I didn't notice. Oh man, it just keeps going.
It's like it's a new computer so fast.
I'm like paging down.
All the spyware on your computer doesn't even slow it down anymore.
Seriously, it's like hundreds. Like I haven't reached the end. Scrolling through backup and sync from wow. So yeah, even if Google's backup stuff completely freaks out on you, you won't even notice. Right now that is
really.
Yeah, so I sorted based on Intel, and the only thing in the Intel category at the moment is backup and sync from Google.
Well, I'm going to use that as my excuse.
There's one Java process that says Intel.
That's how I'm going to resist buying one, because there's still some things with like some like background processes. I don't know. I'll be patient for a while. Yeah.
Hey, the backup and sync from Google is working, and my CPU load. Okay, yeah. So right now I've just got IntelliJ open, but in 2 windows. But my current CPU load is what, like 10% or something? How do you see that? And there's a system 10%, user 19%, idle 68%. Like it's just not doing anything. And I'm running this, live stream. And like memory, so I have the 16 gigs of memory, which was the highest amount.
Right now I'm at like memory use. It says 12. It's never been a problem. Before the native versions of IntelliJ and WebStorm came out, the memory, they were sucking up a lot of memory, but now that they've got the new Apple versions, they're fine. So, and they released those within like, I don't know, a month or so. So, yeah, so it was a little flaky before that with those, but now that they've been updated, it's totally fine.
So as I understand, there are rumors that like sometime this year they're going to bring out like their next set of the new computers. I feel like those are going to be a lot harder to resist.
Yeah, but I thought about it, and because I bought this on I have an Apple card, so it's really hard for me to resist buying things because
you just like press and it just like take my money and
anything from the Apple Store is like 12 months, same as cash, automatically on your card. So
like, it'll be obsolete before you even pay for it,
right? Well, yeah, I'm like, okay, so the MacBook Pros are gonna be released, like end of 2021. People are saying that's when my installment plan will be up. Just get the next one. But I'm barely using this thing. Like I have a MacBook Air, and I feel like I don't do a job that actually, justifies as much power as this thing has. What justification would I possibly have for getting something more powerful next year? Like, unless I suddenly go into like extreme video editing, like my job as a developer just isn't that hard for this computer. There's really no reason. There's just really no reason. And the only limitation I thought it had was the whole only having one external monitor. But I fixed that by buying a $75 part on Amazon. And
yeah, I remember you talking about that. You like did some research and bought the right kind of dongle, and now you can have as many as you want.
Right, you can have up to like 5 external monitors. So that was like my last remaining use case for actually like buying a new one next year. So I'm good.
So
yeah.
So you'll have to be more creative next year, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. Well, Apple has a lot of product lines for me to spend my money on. So, I could always use a new watch, a new phone, yeah. I'm sure I'll find a way to keep my installment plans going.
Well, I am suitably impressed. I have my, what used to be the shiny new Mac, from I believe 2019, which feels like 10 years ago at this point. But I mean, it has fans and it uses them a lot. That's kind of my least favorite computing feature is like even like running this stream for some reason I don't know the innards of why, but all of these browser based chat tools, they use more CPU than something like Zoom that runs outside the browser. And so like the machine, it can't stay at idle. It has to use enough that the fans kick on. Well, and any more Mac praise before we go to our programmery topics of the week?
Well, in my household, we have a 2005 era iPod Nano. So I can talk about that. And that's really the only Mac Apple hardware in the house at all. So I don't think we really need a review of that.
Chris, on your thing about you ordered it, whatever, 3 hours after the presentation.
45 minutes. But
so yeah. I've never ordered anything. I've never ordered one quite that soon, but I ordered an iPad like a day after it was announced. But I was like out of town. I actually had my dad go to the Apple store to pick it up, as soon as the store opened.
I actually resisted because I just couldn't see the use case for an iPad when it first came out. And I actually am like, and they were like, what, $600-$700?
It's so long ago, I don't remember.
I don't need that. And that was like netbooks had been a thing, and I'm like, I can get like a netbook for $300, and I could like maybe do some software development on it, maybe if it's like got Linux on it. So I got a netbook and put Ubuntu on it, and it was a horrible choice, but it wasn't long before I broke down and bought the iPad.
and that means you get to have both.
Yeah,
both. How fantastic!
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we should talk about our actual tech topics. So the first one we had on our list was and this is like I guess we'll talk about it like Angularisms, because that's kind of what we all use the most often. But like, how big should a component be? Lance doing the James Bond cat petting move here, but whenever I'm dividing a screen into components, I sort of always feel guilty that my components are too big and also that they're too small. I feel like there should be some kind of guideline or theory or something of like how big is a component too big that you should like split out some other components so that it has less code in it. And by big, I don't mean like how big it is visually on the screen. I mean like how much code is too much.
Well, and I wonder, is the real metric the lines of code or the conceptual complexity? Because I can imagine
probably some of each.
Yeah, because I can imagine a component that is really short in lines of code and lines of HTML, but it has two very different sections, and we would split that up as into separate components or separate subcomponents. Whereas you could have a much larger component in terms of the amount of code that's necessary to execute what it actually does, whereas also conceptually consistent that it doesn't make sense to break it down.
There's also the size of like the JavaScript code versus the size of like the template. You know, like there may not be much logic, but if the template's like 2 pages long, it may just be hard to like follow through and reason about it too. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, the place where I write the very most awkwardly oversized components, and I'm like, this definitely should be split, is when I'm doing a complicated form, because it's possible to split a form up across components, but it's kind of inconvenient, and so that inconvenience, I sometimes delay because of the inconvenience until I have, maybe 100 lines of TypeScript, but 1,000 lines of template or something.
Sorry, my cat just freaked out there. What did you
the job of cats.
Yeah. Well, and so Chris and I, for those who are watching this and don't know us personally, Chris and I have worked together with several companies for many years. And the first job that we did Angular together with was with the previous company. And it was actually AngularJS. And we didn't really care much at that point about like splitting components up. Well, I mean, they weren't even
Java developers.
Yeah, we were Java developers who didn't really understand AngularJS or JavaScript or anything at that point. And so our first controller, it was thousands of lines of code.
Probably, I don't remember.
And
That's
so
a lot.
Yeah, it's so part of the conversion from Angular to Angular or AngularJS to Angular for us was the opportunity to completely break that up, and that is when we really started thinking in terms of component size. But we have a proof of concept that you can write a component that is thousands of lines long and it will work, but it's not good code in any stretch.
Yeah, so I mean, thousands is almost certainly. Like if you have thousands of lines, it probably should be split.
Yeah, I in that same project actually, later on when once Lance and I had become the ones who knew everything, and we were trying to do all these good practices, then I had another developer coming in and doing some work for the project, and he wasn't breaking anything up, and every feature was one component, and I'm like, what are you doing? And his reasoning was, well, I'm not going to reuse any of these pieces anywhere else, so why would I break it up? And it's like, no, that's not the right mentality. We're not splitting it up to make reusable pieces. That's great if you can reuse it, but we're breaking it up just to make it easier to maintain and follow. So
yeah. I think reusability is a sufficient condition to break something up, but it's not the only thing you should be looking at.
Yeah. Okay. So clearly, if you want to reuse this chunk, you need to make it a component. So that's like an easy case.
Yeah.
And I would argue that at some point, just the sheer size, it's thousands of lines. Yeah. That's kind of like, I mean, this is just out of control. Like, we got to do something. But like, what about the hard cases?
A lot of that, if you have a lot of TypeScript code, you might not see it if you follow the pattern of extracting out the actual logic to a service or to just pure functions in a utility file, which is a good pattern. Like it is useful to have the code that you want to write your unit tests for not be associated with a UI.
Yeah.
And so you can sometimes not realize how big your code is because it's all off in utilities and services.
Yeah, that's a good point. You could have a component that's conceptually huge, and it may have a pretty big template, but it could still have a pretty small TypeScript file just because you've pushed it aside. Interesting.
Well, and another example where the template could be small, but you could still have a whole bunch of code is something that I've dealt with on my current project, where we had, for our primary state management technique, we were using a large nested form group, reactive forms. And then we had AG grid to display things. And so converting the data from the nested form way of holding things into AG grid, and then particularly just because of some of the weirdnesses in the grid that we were showing, like there was a lot of code, even though the amount that was actually related to the grid or was actually in the template was really just, now I'm passing in my grid options to the AG grid. So the template was tiny, but there was a lot of TypeScript code. But another thing with that particular example is on that project, we are currently in the process of converting from using the reactive forms as our primary state management to NGRX. And so one of the things that I've done when I get to these components that have AG grid in them and have all this logic for figuring out how to go from the state management data to AG grid and then back to the state management when a change has happened, is I have extracted out the AG grid part of those components to presentational or dumb components that just receive the data, initial data from their parent through an input, and then export their data through an emitter when any changes happened. And then those components are completely isolated from whatever the state management is, and it makes the code overall easier. And so that's yet another reason you might want to break it down, just to have a presentational component that doesn't have to deal with anything. It wasn't about lines of code. It wasn't about lines of template. It was conceptually like just the conceptual burden of having AG grid work with whatever the state management technique was. I wanted to break that. I wanted to decouple those. So I made a component to break the coupling.
That's really great. Like you hit a point where, I'm trying to see if I understand this right, where the complexity was a mix of code that was like the application's code and code that was just like adapting to how you're using this component. And so you just like sliced along that contour and got two much cleaner chunks as a result. That's very cool.
Yeah, basically, like from one perspective, this component was dealing with one library for one part of it, and it was dealing with another library for another part. So, data, how it got the data and how it passed the data around versus how it presented the data. And so I created a subcomponent just to not have those things interact. And previously, we had an NX lib that we called, I think, reactive grid. That was full of a bunch of utils for how to tell AG grid to validate the forms and all that. And that whole set of utils disappeared when I no longer had any component where that interface existed. The interface of those is at a component break.
That's great.
That's good, yeah.
And I actually tweeted about that this past week. Well, step one for making this conversion, something like, break this up so you don't have the coupling. And step two, regret your initial choice that ever required this. And the AG Grid company actually retweeted the first one, but not the second one about the regret.
Well, you weren't regretting AG. I mean, I've heard you say great things about AG Grid. Yeah. So you definitely weren't regretting AG Grid.
No, I wasn't regretting. I wasn't regretting reactive forms. They're great. I wasn't regretting NGRX. I wasn't regretting AG Grid. I was regretting the initial choice of commingling the code between these different concerns.
Yeah. So I guess we have a few we only have a few live viewers. I don't know how many later views they are. I guess for their sake, we should point out that we are all consultants. So we are working on kind of making our own internal stuff, making training, but most prominently solving hard, painful things for our customers who are mostly like enterprise with big, complex stuff. And so that's why almost everything we step into has just a lot of code and a lot of controls. And, there's a reason why, just at random, Lance, your most recent project has this like large component complexity all over it, right? Because like that's just like the nature of what we end up working on.
Yep.
So I have a couple components that are big because their HTML template is the output of Markdown processing. So I'm like, basically write a component in Markdown and then compile that to HTML, which becomes the Angular component HTML. but like the amount of code, like the TypeScript code is this much. And I didn't write any of the HTML, but because it's generated from Markdown, it's quite large. I feel like that's probably like a really inefficient way to get content onto a screen in a browser. But I haven't noticed the Angular compiler complaining just because I might have thousands of lines of HTML. I've never like handwritten thousands of lines of HTML in a component. I think when I got to 1,000 once with a form and like said this is ridiculous. But like, how big of components have you seen?
Well, you mean besides the one I mentioned earlier that was a couple thousand lines?
You said you saw one that was a couple thousand lines of template. Have you seen bigger?
I have not. Maybe Chris has, and on her
I'm
clients.
not sure about template. Like I know there was one project I was brought into to try to refactor and break up, and I don't know about the template, but the lines of code in the classes were averaging 3,000 to 5,000 for each component JavaScript class, and those were pretty bad. And just you couldn't tell what was going on. It was crazy.
And of course, this is not a problem that's unique to Angular or web at all. Back in my Java days, I joined a team where we had a single Java file. It was a class that was 25,000 lines long, and we considered it a big refactoring improvement that we extracted a method out that was 5,000 lines to its own class. So
that is impressive, although I have done this too.
Yeah. So yeah, this is not the fault at all of Angular or TypeScript or the web. Yeah.
I mean, right. Developers are going to do the same thing no matter what tool you give them. They're going to find a way to recreate the same issues. So
yeah. I mean, I know that I did quite a lot of Java, as you know, but our handful of viewers might not. Back in the 1999 to 2009 or so. So I had about 10 years of just very extensive Java development. And yeah, I was on projects where we had that. We had how big can a Java file be before the compiler refuses to accept it? And yeah, there actually is a limit. There's I think it's a source file size limit, but there is a size limit which it is possible to hit.
Number of characters or something.
Yeah, but even before that, in C++, the C++ compilers, I think now and definitely then are like much slower than what we expect from working with many other languages. Because C++ is so capable. There are so many things you can express in C++ that compilers tend to be quite slow. And so you can really create misery for yourself if you write your project in a small number of enormous C++ files. And by you can, I mean I did. Well, I mean, is it worth having should a lint tool complain if your source file or components getting too big? Like, is that
I'm pretty sure. What is it? What's the one thing everyone's using these days?
That tool that Sonar, yeah.
I'm pretty sure it does that with your TypeScript.
Complain?
I'm pretty sure it complains about TypeScript methods. Maybe. I'm trying to remember. I used it recently. But I think it does the complexity checks and things that used to see in the Java stuff.
So there's stuff that it's not like specifically about size, but it ends up being about size.
Well, I'm looking at ESLint. You can enforce a maximum file length with max lines rule.
Yeah. I just looked on TSLint, which of course is deprecated, but it has a max file line count in TSLint also.
Apparently the default is 300, but maybe, and I know that my current project breaks that. So maybe it's not enabled by default. I'm not sure.
Yeah, maybe that the number has a default, but the rule might be default off.
Yeah.
Huh.
But I mean, there's also, you can do cyclomatic complexity, sorry, I misspoke, and max depth, max length, max lines per function. There are a lot of different things that you can do as ESLint. I don't know how many are turned on by default in a modern Angular NX project.
Huh. It seems like definitely worthy of a look for anybody on a project, especially a project with a large team, particularly if maybe a lot of junior developers who might not have yet suffered the miseries that come from overly large or complex functions.
I feel like those checks became quite common or commonplace in Java projects after a while. So
yeah, I used to use some variant of that. I think the cyclomatic complexity one, I think I had that turned on in a project that I did in Java in that era. So how about the other direction? Is there such thing as making unnecessary work and complexity by dividing a project into too many components? Because one of my frustrations when I use Angular is there are just a lot of push-ups to do per component. So basically, if you follow the style guide and everything, for every component you get a directory, a TypeScript file, an HTML file, a CSS file, a spec file, and probably some other things that I'm thinking that I'm forgetting.
Yeah, I mean, I typically don't do that. I mean, have all those files for a small component.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm just trying to break up a template, really, and there's no logic in the component, I'm really just trying to break the template into some logical pieces. And so you end up with a component that's basically like a few lines of HTML, no actual code really, or maybe like just an input and an output or maybe just some inputs. I'm probably just going to have one file and not in its own directory. It's going to be in the same directory as the main component for that feature. And it's just a little thing, component.ts, and it's got everything in line. And I'm not going to have a test for it because there's no logic really to test. I'm just trying to get that template broken up so that when you look at the main component's template, you can just look at it more quickly and see the different pieces and what it's doing. So it's not really functionally doing much to help you other than just making it easier to look at that big template in the main component.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, if you're getting to the point that you have a bunch of small components, then they're probably small enough to not need multiple files. And if they're just inputs and outputs, there's no reason even for a unit test potentially. So yeah, you could all just have it you could have an entire component in 20 lines of a single file.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think there's any hazard of a zealot coming by and complaining that it doesn't follow the style guide?
There's always that hazard.
Or do we deal with zealots in some harsh way?
Just ignore them.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any of the style guides that would prohibit a single file component.
Oh, I'm under the impression, which could be wrong, that the Angular CLI is actually its defaults are a implementation of an Angular style guide, which says you shall make your components have the following.
I thought it was always like you shall, your team should agree on a minimal or a maximum line length before it becomes multiple files or something. It's been a while since I actually read the actual style guide.
Yeah, I guess I'll put it in our chat where anyone following along could see it.
Oh, yeah.
Here, I'll click it so it comes up and shows. So that's where the style guide is for anyone watching along.
Find the chat. Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's both a chat and then which shows up on the YouTube chat that this streams to, and then there's a button I can click that takes messages in the chat and makes them visible on the stream. So can you see the thing I just put visible? Okay.
Yeah.
Anyways, yeah, it's just so I'm now curious what it says.
File structure conventions.
Extract templates and styles to their own files when more than 3 lines is what they say.
Okay. I think 3 lines is pretty short. I would do more like 7 or, just sort of depends.
Yeah. Yeah, when I'm teaching the class and this comes up, yeah, I'll basically say, too big gets uncomfortable, too small gets uncomfortable, but it's up to your team to decide for yourselves. I didn't realize that the style guide explicitly gave a number. That's not the approach I would take, but maybe if you're creating a style guide and you just say something fuzzy, then everyone will just ignore it. So you're kind of forced to do it for that particular purpose.
Yeah, I am so totally torn on that. Because on one hand, whenever I step into a larger project, the more there's just like some guide or some rule that you can just adopt and use and not talk about, then like the more time you save, the more you get to the heart of the project. But on the other hand, when I read things like that, I kind of have the same reaction as you did, Chris. Like 3 lines, like that's a really small number. I mean, yeah, but you could easily say, well, yeah, it should be 7 lines, not 3 lines. But yeah, I don't know. It's I don't want to stop and like study the thing in detail, but it's not clear to me if the whole like folder structure part is dictated by the style guide or if that's just a default of Angular CLI.
Can you? I know within X, I'm pretty sure you can pass in a flag that says flat or something. I'm assuming that's the same. I'm assuming that's just the CLI Angular CLI feature as well. But
yeah, there's a flag. There are flags that you can tell it to flatten, which just puts all the same files at the same level. Or there's flags you can like tell it to inline the styles or inline the template.
Yeah.
So part of at least our placeholder name for our event here is this Code Talk Teach, and that's because most of the stuff that we talk about ends up in some way connecting to our Angular classes that we teach. I guess I'll take a moment to plug live today, being taught while we are doing this. There is an Angular for Architects class. Which has much deeper coverage, probably of some of the same stuff we're talking about. Anyway, I know that a struggle that we found there is that when we apply the rules like, for simple components, inline the templates and styles, we had people who were new to Angular found it like needlessly distracting that our components were set up differently than the ones that Angular CLI generates. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't do it because of that. Just that is a like each kind of difference is a potential stumbling block to like a new person coming into the tech for the first time.
Yeah, and they're like, "Where's the HTML file?" Yeah.
Yeah.
I can see that.
So So how can I describe this? I've worked on many projects in the past, but at the moment, both of you work on a lot more real work, you're in a lot more deeper into customer code than I am right now. Have you seen anything like that where like variations in structure cause new people to a project to stumble?
Not really. But then also, there tends to be a lack of consistency when we arrive anyway. So, I mean, not everybody's using the CLI right every time. That I don't know. I haven't seen a project where everything was perfectly consistent in the first place.
So if there's already inconsistency, then like adding more to make the code less of a less overwhelming is like obviously not a problem.
Yeah. We've already crossed that line.
How about you, Lance?
I don't think that particular thing has caused a problem. There are often so many other conversations that happen. I don't remember that one coming up.
What are there any other factors to like component size that we haven't talked about?
I would say, go ahead.
One thing about like, is it too small? Is it too broken up? I guess one thing is if it starts to get painful, like, if you've worked too hard to break up a component so that there's a bunch of little bits of data that you're like trying to pass around to too many places, the coordination of all these little small components within your feature component, if that's getting burdensome, maybe that's a sign that you tried too hard to break it up. If the data you're passing around really is local to that outer component and you don't want to move it into like state management or something, but maybe if you're passing stuff around too much, maybe you broke it down too far. Just trying to think of, because I think your earlier question was like, when have you gone too far making it small? And
Yeah,
might be
it's
a
like,
consideration.
maybe if you're spending more lines of code on the inputs and outputs,
Yeah,
than you spend on the template that uses the inputs and outputs, you should
Yeah.
maybe think twice. I like that. Yeah, because I have been frustrated when I had to wire up like an input and an output, and like it took like several lines each to like really use those correctly, like import their types and everything, and then end up using them, you know, briefly once in the template. It's sort of like it's like I use this variable once, but I have one line of code of use and 9 lines of code of carrying it to where I need it, and that's maybe not like efficient in terms of getting the program done. Yeah, I mean, so I don't think I've ever seen a real project where it was broken down too finely into components. Have you ever seen that happen in a real project, or is that sort of a theoretical?
I think that's more theoretical. I think that's more like something I might start to do and then stop myself. Yeah. Like, oh wait, this is getting too ridiculous. Back up.
Well, I could see like going through a phase of having that. Like when I first learned about smart DOM or presentational view components or container, we need to decide what the actual name of that pattern is. But I had a habit at that point of anytime I started a conceptually what was a single component is, I would create 2 components, and I'd have the view and the main component and the view component, and so that just got scattered everywhere, and you could kind of look at the code and say, oh, so Lance wrote this in June, and so I could see that sort of thing, but I haven't actually seen anyone really take that too seriously yet.
I love that. It's like, yeah, I'd be like, go to Anga lunch, come back, redo the whole app to like the extreme. Everything is down effect. Everything is down effect.
Yeah,
I love it.
Yeah, on some level it's faddishness, but on another level, like in order to realize what the bounds are and when things make sense and don't, you kind of have to really try it.
Yeah, no, totally. I'll like try some technique to the point of ridiculousness just to understand it, even knowing, hey, I would not do this like for real. I'm just like trying this crazy thing to see what happens. So now I'm tempted to like go find all my components that have more than one of something and find a way to split them up or something. Yeah. Or find any component that has like the same like repeated pattern. Yeah, here's a question. Is there some point at which if you're repeating like a pattern in the template, you should be like, no, this is ridiculous. I need to make that into a component. Like if you see it, like I feel like if I see like 5 lines of HTML repeated twice, that I just like, I chill. It's like, it's not going to pay off to carefully extract those 5 lines just to only use it twice. But like, is there a threshold at which it's more compelling that now that I'm, it's 10 lines of code used 3 times, like, do you have a guideline?
I have been on projects in the past, this is in the Java days, where people said, if you do something twice, let it happen. But if you do it 3 times, then figure out how to get rid of the duplication. I don't have a hard rule for something like that. It kind of tends to be more of a feeling of, man, I've been doing this a lot. So no, I don't have anything specific, but when I see it, and then when I'm doing that a lot, eventually I'll see it, or someone might point it out in a PR like, hey, these lines of code. One thing that is interesting is so much of my career, I was an IntelliJ user, and then I was doing VS Code for quite a while. But now a lot of the VS Code was when we were in the office together and we were just switching machines. I do VS Code because that's what everyone else has. But a couple months ago, I realized, hey, I haven't actually been in a room with another developer in months. I might as well go back to WebStorm, give that a shot. And so a tool that comes out of the box with WebStorm that VS Code doesn't have is duplication detection. And so like I'll be running across code and there'll be a little yellow squiggly underneath some code saying, hey, this is a duplicate. And I'll look at it and sometimes it's just directly code. Like usually it's like in a unit test, like I'm setting up 2 different tests that are the same and then I don't worry about it. But sometimes it's like, oh yeah, if I extract out that variable, these 2 things are actually the same thing. And I think about it. So now that I'm using a tool that puts that in front of me, I might think about it more, but no, not a whole lot otherwise.
That's awesome. I totally want that.
Yeah.
A tool that notices duplication and starts like kind of hinting at it.
And
Great.
And it's not just doing string by string comparisons. It will say, if you could extract a variable for this thing, and if so you can have cats running across the screen while you're talking. You can extract a variable, or you could like pass in this string because it's just 2 different strings that otherwise are the same. So it's very intelligent. So
like, yeah, I mean, like if you wrote a loop twice and it's the same loop but just with a different variable name, like it's still duplication. Like you don't get a free pass because you renamed the.
Yeah. And it's even more sophisticated than just that example. I've seen some other ones that are like, I'm really impressed that you figured out that, yeah, those are the same things essentially.
Yeah. It's one of those large projects where people have copied and pasted components all over the place. It definitely picks it up. It's kind of depressing actually, but I used that before.
So another vector, another angle that I don't know if we want to talk to, or maybe this will be a topic for a different show, of potential duplication and potentially bringing things down is there's a movement now called SCAM, which I don't know if it's a great, well-named thing, for single component Angular modules. And so there are people out there who will advocate for every component should live within its own module. And so if you're talking about, is there too much overhead from breaking a component into multiple components? Well, now we're adding the overhead, or at least some people are, of an entire module for every individual component. And they have big arguments and big justifications why it's worth it. I haven't gone down that road yet, but it's worth talking about perhaps.
I like them to be pretty granular, but so I would go with that if you have a component and it has a few children that are only ever used in that component, I would put those all in the same module, as like internal implementation details. But it is nice that if you have every component that is actually used in more than one place in its own module, it really, it can be beneficial for things like figuring out lazy loading and all this other stuff and making sure what really depends on what. For one thing, if you have a big module with a bunch of components in it and you're trying to figure out, okay, this module is importing like 10 things. Who's using these things? It can be, trying to track that stuff down after the fact and figure out what's using what. It gets a little complicated. If you just start off with these smaller packages and this feature component here is using this third-party library, and I go open another module and it's importing a different third-party library. I know exactly where it's being used. I don't have to sift through 10 different components trying to figure out where those dependencies are coming in and stuff.
So I'll confess to using scams, I guess. I hate the name too, but I actually have if I was better at this, I would have a custom schematic. But what I actually have is a bash script, so that I can type a single command and generate a module and a component, named so that they all mesh together and work correctly the first time. So I often, if I'm making a new component that's going to be kind of it's going to be, I guess, like a major component in a sense, right? They might have some minor components added in later, but it's like a important component. I now usually just by default make it have its own module for all those same reasons, Chris.
Yeah.
I think one of the Angular team people said in a talk somewhere that there's a possibility of a future Angular, like you might not need modules in some cases. I don't know where where that And I guess they have a roadmap now, but I have no idea where that might fall in their roadmap. But I remember that being as maybe a thing.
And it might be a now former member of the Angular team, in which case maybe that idea doesn't have a champion. I don't know. I'm just speculating.
I'm going to try to find that Angular roadmap. Angular was affiliated with a search engine to help find the roadmap. Here we go. I have a link. I'll put the link in the chat. Here, this is the roadmap in the documentation, which is pretty cool. I thought it was like a blog post at one point, but I searched for it, and yeah, it's actually included in the official Angular documentation, which is kind of cool.
Well, the second to last item in there is simplified Angular mental model with optional ng modules.
Oh, yeah. It's like it's still there, Lance.
We'll be working on making them optional. The work will allow developers to develop standalone components and implement an alternative API for declaring the component's compilation scope.
Well, then, so maybe at some point, like we'll just get that for free. I know that in the short term, it definitely adds. Like, I'm not sure how many bytes it's adding, but it definitely kind of makes the project feel like a bigger deal. It just feels heavier to have all these extra module files floating all over, and you end up with a lot more. You end up with a lot more lines of code importing all the right modules to all the right places, so you can use the components. So there's definitely a just like a bookkeeping overhead.
But where it says implement an alternative API for declaring the component's compilation scope, I mean, is it really going to be less overhead, or is it just going to be different overhead? Like, you don't know what that looks like.
I'm hoping it means you just put a couple more, like another annotation or something. It's like just like a couple lines, but who knows? It's just. It seems like it really seems like it's at the idea stage from the roadmap. Yeah. So, and it's under the future. I guess they have two sections, right? I see, in progress. But future could mean like quite soon in the future. They're not ruling out it happening soon anyway. Cool. Well, what else can we say about component size, or do we want to go on to our other topic? I'm getting breath sound. Somebody's microphone is too close to their mouth or something. I don't know. I think mine's about 3 inches seems to be enough. I don't know if there's like an official spec, but if you get the right, there's a trade-off point where it works well. Okay, so our other topic, which I have the chart for the document in front of me here, was just talk about different ways of using CSS in Angular.
Yes.
And I know that all three of us have done quite a lot of fighting CSS in our Angular.
Yeah. So
I personally have come through that not like really liking any way that I've done it. I don't have like a favorite way to do it.
My current stance really is, so when Angular came out with the kind of the encapsulation of the styles and all that, it seemed really cool. But then having been put onto all these large enterprise projects where developers have been doing whatever, it's just been so horribly abused that I kind of wish it wasn't there at all. Even though it does have some good use cases. So usually what I end up doing is coming in and trying to delete all those component CSS files and trying to come up with a good global style architecture, which then really you're going back to trying to research, how to structure global CSS, which is a larger than Angular, topic. But then, coming up with global style sheets that have well-scoped styles, which could be, they could be scoped by the name of the element, and you get almost the same effect as having the encapsulation. And it's just a lot cleaner because what most developers that I've seen end up doing is just copying and pasting huge chunks of CSS into every component CSS file, which is definitely not the intention of the feature, and just gets into a horrible state and is really hard to refactor later.
Yeah. We have a coworker, Mr. Bill Odom, who's kind of famous in some parts of the internet, who has very, very strong feelings about this, and kind of in the same lines of Chris. Bill is very strongly oriented towards having global styles and not having component level styles. And when he sees component styles, his basic opinion is that the only component styles that you should have are styles that are necessary to make the component function the way it is. So like if you have a button where like the button, we lost Kyle, where the button displays incorrectly, like just truly incorrectly, like the wrong parts of the widget are visible without that style, then you put that at the component level. But if it's margins and stuff like that, then you use your selectors in the global state. And I try to do that. I try to follow his advice, but the other path is just so much easier because the file's right there. It's just right there. Yeah. And I haven't quite figured out how to do that approach well, and maybe Chris has great experience with this, in an exified monorepo type project where I have, the components are in this UI lib here, and then there's one general scope. So does the app level global scope file have that information about the individual libs? But then what if I reuse that UI component from a particular library in multiple apps? And I just haven't figured out a good way to handle that.
Am I back? Does my audio video work now? I had a glitch and I had to reset
a little laggy, but
yeah, it's still not great, Kyle.
Yeah. Okay, I'll keep researching. Well, if you can hear me all, the thing you're describing that Bill Odom says about like only doing like structural things in the component CSS but doing visual stuff globally, like I agree with that 100%.
Yeah.
I've been so totally burned by like copy pasting the same visual thing from like component to component to component. I'm like really leery about doing very much in the component CSS.
Yeah. So I mean, like the last customer we tried to help, they had this problem where the designers would design mockups, use a certain look and feel. Developers would go and develop each feature, like sort of independently. They would look at the mockup for that feature and implement all the styles directly in that feature's component CSS. And then the designers, they see this as a constantly iterative thing, right? So they get a version of the product, they get feedback, they have user studies, then they redesign the look and feel. And then they're like, wait, why is it going to take 6 months to change the color of this app? And it's like, well, because the developers just went and just copied verbatim each mockup into each component. They don't have they didn't create an overall design. And so that's really the pitfall there. And so having the global styles allows you to, quickly make kind of retheme or update the whole website based on feedback from, the UX folks. In answer to Lance's question, so I haven't had so one thing with NX, trying to figure out where to put global styles, and that kind of makes sense. Never quite got the feel for that. But in some more recent projects, they were using CSS custom properties, which sounds like a good solution for what you were describing. So if you actually are creating components that you want to use in multiple contexts, or you just really do want to encapsulate them so that you don't have a global style sheet sitting somewhere else that's concerned about the details of a component in a library, then you as the author of the library can design your component using CSS custom properties so that you can use encapsulation, but kind of expose the parts that would need to be themed or restyled as these variables that can easily be set from a global style sheet. So if your component says, well, okay, you're going to give me these variables like background color, accent color, whatever, and then you can do all the CSS for the component in the library, And then in the global style sheet, you can just specify values for those variables. And so you're decoupling that a bit. So you're still able to quickly change the look and feel at the global level without having to kind of dig down too deep into the component's actual details. And if you use kind of a consistent, naming convention for your variables and stuff, I can see how you could come up with a good strategy for that.
So I've seen a couple things that do this, but I've not done this. Let me try to describe back what you said to see if I understood it.
Okay.
So for example, like you have like maybe like an application level background color that you prefer, an application level text color, an application preferred width between elements or something. But you don't want to copy and paste, Arial 10 point and 37 pixels into all your things. So instead you make a global CSS file and you set those to be CSS variables, right? And those become global?
It follows the cascade,
right,
like anything else does, yeah.
So then in your component, you might put CSS in the component that sets the thing to be the right color, but you wouldn't hard code what the background color is. So you'd still have component CSS like routing that background color variable into the right variable.
Right. So you would say, okay, I want the color of this widget to be, and then you give a variable name, and then you can give a default value. So your component can work out of the box without any global styling, but it's easy for the user to actually, the consuming application to override those without any ng deep or magic like that. So you can have fully encapsulated components that expose only what they want to expose. So you still get all the benefits that were kind of the whole idea of having this encapsulation in the first place, so that the components aren't unexpectedly affected by global styles, but you can still change the things that make sense to change without having to resort to things like ng deep, which usually cause lots of problems.
Yeah. So you've actually done a project this way? Like, did it work out well?
Yeah, it's great.
It sounds pretty great.
The whole thing was themed. They did theming and custom properties, and it worked great because they were creating a component library to be used like in their whole organization. It was actually built on Material. I think Material was using it internally, or
so Material, at least I last used Angular Material very heavily, like a year and a half ago or something. And at the time anyway, and I don't think they've like changed it radically, but at the time they were using Sass to achieve those same things. Instead of CSS variables, like you'd have like you'd have this file where you would set a bunch of Sass variables, and then you'd have to apply that file or use that file like from many places, including from your components. But then at least your component could go and grab the theme, like say whatever the theme currently has for the foreground, whatever color in our current Material theme, use that color here. But that was all done using Sass.
right.
It's
been a few months, like 6 months since that project. I'm trying to remember. I remember using the custom properties and it working well. I don't know if it was with the Material or with some of the other stuff that they were using, but
Sass is compile time, so it's a little bit of a pain because it's totally gone by the time you get into your
right. And if
your
you're
dev
using
tools.
Sass, then you're going to do imports and things like that. And so then getting back to the next question, using Sass variables and imports and stuff, you're going to be coupling things together. And like, where do you put those files when you have NX with applications and libraries being split out? Whereas with the CSS custom properties, you don't have that problem. You don't have to do imports or tie things together. It just gets all figured out as part of the normal CSS cascading process. So,
So what you described is something I haven't done. I don't have personal experience with it, but it sounds a lot like what our colleague Paul Spears talked about in an Angular lunch near the end of last year. So I put a link to that in the chat for this.
Yeah, how do I put a comment somewhere?
I can look for that.
No, I put the link in the chat already.
Oh, it's in the chat? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's a dumb question. How do I put a link in the chat?
I don't see it in the chat from here, Lance.
It's in the YouTube chat.
In the YouTube chat.
Oh, okay.
Oh, let me. I will refresh my YouTube and see if it.
And unfortunately, I need to go. I have a client meeting starting. So
yeah, that happens.
So I don't know if you're going to continue on chatting without me. If so, I'll say goodbye, or if we're all going to say goodbye.
We'll chat for a couple more minutes, but I imagine it won't be much longer.
All right.
Well, thanks for being here. Good luck.
Thanks. See you, viewers, and see you in a couple weeks. Bye.
Kyle, I'm sending you on our work chat a couple links because I can't figure out how to put them in this thing.
Yeah, here I'll put them in here just so others who come by here can see them. So here's one of them I'll make visible, and it's in the YouTube chat now.
So that has it says why you should care, but it has a really great, like, especially if you go down a bit to where it talks about the var function, it has a really great example of exactly what I was talking about. It's with actual simple code. The other one is an old blog post by Stephen Fluen.
Here,
Just pretty old at this point, but still relevant. Where he talks about the different choices you have with Angular as far as how to specifically how to deal with trying to style third-party components and things like that.
I'll feature this one. This is Paul's Angular CSS talk that was mentioned a minute ago. And then what was the other one you said that we should get in here?
It's Stephen Fluen's blog post from actually quite a while ago as well, but still very relevant.
And if you remind me what it's about, I'll try to search for it and get it. Or did you send me a link?
Oh, I sent it to you in the
okay. Okay. The state of CSS and Angular. Yes, that's obviously highly relevant now that you mention it.
It's a real great quick synopsis of what your actual options are. And CSS custom properties are one of the things that he mentions in there.
Yeah, I get this. So here it is on the screen, but it's also in the chat.
Yeah, and I mean, these are pretty old now. So, I mean, it should be a fairly available feature at this point, I would think.
Yeah, I know that at one point, like IE does not have CSS variables, and that turns out to be an extremely expensive, resource-intensive feature to polyfill or to backfill to an old browser. So it's technically possible to do it, but it makes it exponentially slower to process CSS if you polyfill that. But yeah, I mean, I feel like in the last few years, we have finally seen our enterprise corporate customer base now mostly does not care about IE. Whereas until just the last couple of years, almost all projects for that audience had to work on IE because there was a certain wing of the company that was stuck that couldn't upgrade for whatever reason. So it seems like there's no big obstacle to using the modern features.
Yeah. And the other, so in his blog post, he gave 3 options. The third one, which is ng deep, which I really don't like. For one thing, you make the tiniest mistake doing that. And yeah, so example from a couple months ago, customer project, huge, lots of copy pasted CSS and component files. They were using material. They wanted it to look completely different from material. So lots of ng deeps in every file. You never know where the styles are coming from. And in a lot of cases, they forgot to put :host before their ng deep, which means that, and their styles would be different. So it's like, well, if I go to page X first, then when I go to page Y, it looks like this. But if I go to page Y first and X hasn't been loaded yet, then it looks different because the styles that X loaded haven't been loaded, and they weren't encapsulated anyway. So it was just so weird. I mean,
that just sounds like, from the point of view of trying to run a project, that just sounds like an explosion of cost.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? Like when you have things like that happen, like whatever you thought, however long you thought the project was going to take or something is just completely exploded.
And it's very hard to explain to management. Wait, all we want to do is change the color of this app from blue to a different shade of blue. Why is it taking 3 months? And it's well, because all this stuff is just insane.
I mean, could you, I wouldn't say fix that, but could you avoid that with some sort of ad hoc lint rule that would look for ng deep used without ng host?
Yeah, I don't know.
And
maybe
flag it.
I don't know if one exists or not.
I mean, but you could write a grep. You could write a command line grep that would find if that ever happened in any of your CSS files project wide and rig that to break your build if it does.
Probably is a lint roll somewhere, but
yeah,
they are using it if there is.
I kind of feel like they got it a little bit backwards. Like ng deep should have implied ng host.
Yeah.
And then there should be something different. It should have been called ng global or something like that. Like it feels like the ng host case is the more justifiable, commonly usable case. And the thing where, hey, once you load this component, you're going to have some global CSS. Good luck. It feels like that should have been the edge case, the one you have to reach. You got to really reach in the toolbox for this component when loaded changes the global CSS of the page.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I had one more kind of accessory comment on this. So I follow and participate in discussion of many different tools, and I use some more different tools here for just other little internal things. I'm only maybe only less than half of what I do nowadays is Angular, although 4 years ago I was doing all Angular. So I do quite a bit of Svelte now. And those folks, they have the same scoped CSS feature that we do in Angular, and it's implemented in almost the same way, and it has almost all the same trade-offs. And it's just interesting to see, this is all being discovered again by a new community with a different tool, and they're coming up with guidelines be really, because they have a way of overriding and writing global CSS. It's not called ng anything, of course, and I don't think they use the word deep. I think the way theirs work, you put in you put in a style tag and you say scope equals global or something like that. There's a real explicit, easy to understand the meaning of this part is global CSS. But yeah, so they're discovering, you can break your app in really interesting ways if you just throw something in global CSS.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to think of anything we haven't mentioned. So I guess one thing, whenever there's discussion of CSS, I always mentioned, most apps should try to use a design system and mostly not write much CSS. Just find, if you can find a way in any app to just pick something off the shelf for a design system that has a high quality implementation, and just mostly like how it looks, mostly just agree to be okay with its defaults, mostly, you can save so much time and budget.
Yeah, definitely. Versus
a design group comes up with mock-ups and then we start implementing. I mean, there's definitely a place for highly branded apps where you have a design group with, they do the whole mock-up process, but that process is just so much more expensive than deciding to mostly like a design system and then only override what you really have to.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think we said the T word yet here. No. Tailwind.
Yeah, I don't know much about that.
So Tailwind is incredibly divisive, because depending on how you look at it, it's either embracing a new, more functional atomic paradigm, or it's just totally giving up and punting and using something that looks more like style tags. I kind of think it's kind of both at the same time. So I'm mostly positive. I'm not a cheerleader of Tailwind, but I'm mostly positive about Tailwind. I have found that with Tailwind, I do have to write a bit more HTML to use more of the Tailwind classes, but it definitely provides so you could use all the same variable things, of course, wouldn't stop you, but it provides its own way of having your color palette be set once globally, and then you can adjust your color palette one place and the whole thing changes, and then you can do things like adjust spacings and so on in some global way if you want to, but most of the time you just don't write any CSS. And I have found for some of the work that I do, 0 is a pretty good amount of CSS to write. I think that the people pitching it need to be kind of careful, because it doesn't mean you don't have to know CSS. You actually still have to know all of CSS. But if you take a mostly Tailwind approach, you mostly don't write. You only write occasional small amounts of CSS to do things that there's not a utility class already in the box to help you with. And then if you kind of follow their docs and like, don't just hard code your app colors everywhere, but actually go ahead and define it. You know, the people who make it actually describe it as being useful for things like design systems. And so I sometimes like, it's just interesting. Like the people inside the Tailwind world see it very differently than people outside the Tailwind world. Anyway, so I'm trying to think. I know we've had a couple of customers that were considering Tailwind. I don't think we've had any major projects come through our pipeline that are actually using it in a major way, but I'm really looking forward to seeing how that turns out. Have you seen it in use in any of your stuff?
Using it, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like percolating into the kind of enterprise space quite slowly, just because like I said, it tends to be pretty divisive. And so, you know, you want to have, when you're doing your responsible governance of your enterprise things, you want to be careful with divisive technologies.
Yeah. Lately, everyone I've seen has been doing just using SAS and trying to hack material like crazy.
Yeah. So there's a link in here to a Paul Spears Angular CSS talk. It's in the chat already here. I'll bring it back up on the screen. The great thing about this talk is that Paul spends the first half of the talk trying to persuade people away from hacking up and greatly modifying material. Then he spends the second half of the talk telling them how. So it's like, you really don't want to do this, but if you still want to do it,
at least do it well.
Yeah, right. At least do a good job, and I'm going to teach you how right now. Stay tuned.
All right.
Well, I guess we should probably wrap up here. We lost one of our hosts. I think we still have a couple of viewers anyway, but we'll be land on the channel. Far more people will stumble across it and watch it on our channel than the handful who watched live. But I guess thank you for being here, Chris. Thank you for being here, viewer, maybe, however many there are. And I guess we'll be back in a couple of weeks. Keep going. Take it easy.